Stephanie was a poor young lady who carried her family's struggles alone. Desperate, she became a maid in the mansion of Alexander, a rich but cold billionaire feared by all. What started as silence between them slowly turned into care, trust, and a love neither expected. But jealousy and betrayal soon threatened to break them apart. Will Stephanie walk away from the man who doubted her? Or will Alexander prove that true love is built on trust and sacrifice? Sit back and find out as we dive into this powerful story. In a busy city that never slept, a young woman named Stephanie lived. She was kind, brave, and full of dreams. She once hoped to finish college, but life changed when her mother fell very sick and her father walked away. Stephanie left school and worked many jobs, cleaning, washing dishes, even serving in restaurants. Though the money was small, she never gave up. With love in her heart, she promised to care for her sick mother and younger sister, no matter how hard it got. One bright Monday morning, Stephanie was cleaning an apartment for a kind lady named Mrs. Lawson. She worked carefully, dusting every corner, never complaining, even when the job was hard. Mrs. Lawson watched her with a gentle smile. "You work harder than most people I know," she said kindly. "Me?" Stephanie asked softly. "Yes, you." Mrs. Lawson nodded. "Have you ever thought about working in a bigger place? My friend manages staff at Mr. Alexander Williams's mansion. And if you like, I can recommend you." The name Alexander Williams made Stephanie's heart skip. Everyone in the city knew him. He was not just rich, he was one of the most powerful men in the country. He owned many companies and buildings in the city. He was also very handsome, tall, and confident. But people said he was also cold, rude, and hard to please. Stephanie hesitated. She had once worked for a strict employer at a bakery, but she had to quit because of how rude and ruthless the employer was. But then, she thought of her mother's health and her younger sister's fees waiting to be paid. With a small smile, she whispered, "Yes, ma'am. Please recommend me." With the help of Mrs. Lawson's kind words, Stephanie's name was sent to the mansion of Alexander Williams. But Alexander was very difficult to please. He trusted no one, and he disliked mistakes. Only very few people could meet his high standards, but he had no choice but to accept Stephanie, because he was short on staff at that moment. 1 week later, Stephanie received a letter inviting her for an interview. She did her best, passed it, and soon began her new job at the mansion. Her first day working at the mansion felt like entering another world. She wore her uniform and held her cleaning tools. The hall was beautiful, with shiny floors and tall windows. Her heart beat fast as she admired its beauty. She had never seen such a beautiful place in her life. She cleaned the rooms carefully, but while she was cleaning the halls, she saw Alexander Williams, the billionaire. He was tall and dressed in a suit. He held a briefcase going out for work when they crossed paths. Stephanie quickly bowed her head. "Good morning, sir," she said. Alexander looked at her once, but said nothing. He just kept walking, as if she was invisible. For a moment, she felt embarrassed and hurt, like she didn't belong. But she remembered her sick mother and her younger sister depending on her. She needed this job. She needed the money. So, she took a deep breath, lifted her head, and kept working. Days turned into weeks, and Stephanie worked very hard in the mansion. She cleaned, cooked, and smiled through her duties, even when tired. But Alexander was never pleased. When she brought him tea, he said it was too sweet. When she neatly arranged his books, he told her to start all over again. His cold words made her feel small and unseen, but she held on, thinking of her sick mother and little sister. What Stephanie didn't know was that Alexander noticed everything: her kindness, her patience, her gentle smile, even when he is rude to her. And slowly, without even realizing it, her light was touching his heart. One stormy evening, Alexander hosted an important dinner for his business partners. Stephanie was asked to help serve drinks. She carefully carried a tray of tall wine glasses, but as she approached the table where the guests were, her ankle bent and she fell to the ground. The glasses tumbled, shattering loudly as red wine spread across the floor. Everyone stopped and stared. Stephanie felt ashamed. Alexander stood up with anger. "Unbelievable," he scolded, his voice cold. "Can't you do even the simplest task?" Tears filled Stephanie's eyes. She wanted to explain it was an accident. but her voice caught in her throat. She bent down and began picking up the broken glass with trembling hands. As she tried to pick them up, one of the broken glasses gave her a sharp cut. While she still struggled with the pain from the cut and the humiliation, she heard Alexander's voice. "Get her out of here," Alexander ordered, his voice sharp and final. That night, Stephanie sat quietly in that staff room, hugging her pillow tight. Her heart felt so heavy, like a stone pressing on her chest. She remembered the sound of breaking glasses again and again, the red wine spilling, and Alexander's sharp, cold words. Each memory made her eyes fill with tears. She had heard he was strict, but she never thought he could be so unkind. Still, she wiped her face and told herself, "I must not give up. For my family, I have to be strong. I need the money." At that same moment, Alexander Williams was also awake. The dinner was over, and the guests had gone. Yet Alexander's thoughts were not on business or profits, as they usually were. They were about Stephanie. He leaned back in his chair. His laptop was open, but forgotten. He remembered the way her face was filled with shame, the way her eyes were wet with tears as she bent down to clean the broken glass. He also remembered the cut on her hand, and his conscience pricked him. Was he too harsh? He had spoken out of anger, not care. He had humiliated her in front of his guests. She was only a maid, a young woman trying to do her job. And yet, each time he yelled at her or rebuked her, she didn't argue or complain. She only bowed her head, apologized, and kept working. Alexander was not used to doubting himself, but tonight, the image of Stephanie in tears with gentle eyes would not leave him. For the first time in a very long time, he wondered if he had been wrong. The next morning after the dinner disaster, Stephanie was about to leave her room when she noticed something strange. She saw a plain white envelope with her name written neatly on the front in front of her door. Someone had slid it underneath the door. She slowly picked the envelope up and opened it. Inside was a thick bundle of cash, far more than her month's pay. Her chest tightened. She knew at once what it meant. Only Alexander could have kept the money there. She figured it was probably money to wipe away the sting of being scolded in front of his guests. Money to silence her pride. Stephanie's hands shook in anger as she recalled the experience from the previous night. She didn't want his pity. She wanted respect. She took a deep breath, marched down the long hall until she reached his study. Alexander was sitting at his desk, typing on his laptop. His face was calm, distant, and unreadable as always. She knocked softly and entered as soon as he gave the command to enter. "Sir," Stephanie said firmly, stepping inside. Alexander looked up, slightly surprised at her bold tone. "Yes?" She stepped forward and held out the envelope. "I found this in my room." "That's for you," he said simply, and continued working on his laptop. "Call it compensation for last night," he said without remorse. Stephanie felt looked down on. Although deep within her, she knew she needed the money more than anything. But she walked up to his desk and placed the envelope firmly in front of him. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice trembling but steadying with every word. "I don't want it." Alexander lifted his head sharply. "What?" he asked, shocked. "I came here to work for my wages, not for your pity," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I may not be rich, but I have pride. If I made a mistake, then correct me. If you want to fire me, then fire me. But don't try to buy my dignity with money." The room went silent, and for a long moment, Alexander just stared at her. No one, neither investors, nor board members, nor even his closest staff, had ever spoken to him like this. Stephanie's hands shook slightly, but she didn't look away. Then, without waiting for his reply, she turned and walked toward the door, ready for whatever may happen next, leaving the envelope untouched on his desk. When the door closed behind her, Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair. He looked at the envelope she had refused, and then he smiled at her boldness and audacity. A lot of thoughts went through his mind. He thought about firing her, but her personality intrigued him, so he decided to keep calm. The evening of the same day, the mansion was quiet. Most of the workers had gone to their rooms, and Alexander was walking down the hall toward his study. As he passed the servants' corridor, he suddenly heard a soft voice. It was Stephanie's voice. She was in the small laundry room on a phone call, but she made sure her voice was as quiet as a whisper. Alexander paused by the doorway. He knew he shouldn't listen. It was not his business, but something in her trembling voice made him stop. "Listen to me, Arda," Stephanie whispered urgently. "Stay away from that man. I don't care how much money he promises you. Nothing is worth your dignity. Don't throw yourself away just because you're desperate. I'll handle things. I'll take care of you and Mama." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced it to be steady. "Just focus on school, okay? Leave the rest to me." The call ended, and for a moment, there was silence. Alexander wanted to continue to his study, but then he heard her crying. Stephanie had buried her face in her hands, crying quietly where no one could see her. Alexander stood frozen where he stood. He had seen so many people beg him for money, flatter him, even betray him for wealth. But here was a maid who would rather break her own heart than let her sister be bought, who returned a huge sum of money that she desperately needed, just because of her dignity. A maid with more pride than most of the powerful people he knew, and in that moment, he felt admiration for her. Silently, he turned and walked away, but his mind was restless. One thought stayed with him, echoing deep inside, the thought that she is different. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study. His papers and laptop lay untouched on the desk. No matter how hard he tried, Stephanie's trembling voice from earlier kept echoing in his mind. "Stay away from that man. I'll do all I can to take care of you and Mama." He rubbed his forehead, unsettled. He wasn't used to this feeling. He had never been moved by someone else's pain. Though it was late, he quickly placed a call across to the kitchen, asking for a cup of coffee so he could stay up and work. Some minutes later, the door to the study creaked open. Stephanie stepped inside, carrying a tray with coffee and a small plate of biscuits. She froze when she saw his eyes on her, and Alexander was even more shocked to see her again. He had no idea she would be sent. I didn't mean to disturb you, sir. The other staff were already asleep," she said softly. "The chef asked me to bring this up." Her eyes were still a little red, though she had tried to hide it. She set the tray down gently, keeping her gaze on the table instead of him. For a moment, Alexander only watched her. Normally, he would have said nothing, or scolded her for no reason at all. But tonight felt different. "Stephanie," he said suddenly. She looked up in surprise. He had never said her name. His eyes stayed on her face, seeing the faint trace of tears. For a moment, he wanted to ask her what was wrong, to tell her she didn't have to carry so much alone. But the words stuck in his throat. Alexander Williams, the cold, distant billionaire, didn't know how to comfort anyone. So instead, he cleared his throat and said in his usual firm tone, "Next time, make sure to knock before you enter." Stephanie nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." As soon as she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair and wondered how she could appear so calm, despite all she might be going through. His voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for himself, and he said with conviction, "She really is different." The next morning, from the moment the sun rose, Stephanie had been running up and down the mansion, sweeping floors, dusting tables, serving food, and making sure every corner was neat. Most of the staff had left due to the strict personality of Alex, so there was more work for the staff left. But what made Stephanie's heart heavy wasn't the work. It was the endless thoughts she couldn't push away. Mama's cough is worse. The medicine costs too much. What if I can't send money this week? What if I fail them? Her chest grew tight as the worries crowded her mind, but she forced herself to keep going. She didn't want anyone to see her weakness. That afternoon, she carried a tray of tea into Alexander's office. He was behind his desk, his eyes fixed on his laptop. As usual, he didn't look up when she greeted him, even though he had mixed feelings when he saw her. "Good afternoon, sir," she said softly. He gave no reply, and she set the tray down carefully, though her hands trembled. For a moment, the room began to spin in her eyes, but she ignored it and kept moving. She had learned to live with the dizziness when she was exhausted. Then, just as she turned to leave, her vision faded to darkness. The tray rattled in her hands. Alexander looked up at her. A sharp pain shot through her head, and before she could steady herself, everything went black. "Stephanie!" Alexander screamed. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice with real alarm. He rushed from his chair and caught her just before she fell to the floor. Her head lay against his chest. Her face was pale and still. For a moment, the cold, untouchable billionaire looked shaken and genuinely concerned. "Call the doctor! Now!" he barked to his assistant, who had run in after hearing the noise. Moments later, the mansion's private doctor hurried in. He checked Stephanie's pulse, then frowned. "She's carrying too much stress," the doctor said. "Her blood pressure is very high. If she doesn't rest and get treatment soon, it could be dangerous." Alexander's jaw tightened. He looked at her lying there on the couch. Her face was pale, yet even in her weakness, there was a quiet strength about her. When Stephanie finally opened her eyes hours later, she found herself in a soft bed. But it wasn't her small servant's room. It was one of the guest suites. She looked around in confusion. The first person she saw was Alexander, standing near the window with his arms crossed. "You fainted," he said flatly, though his voice was gentler than before. "The doctor says it's from stress and high blood pressure." Stephanie sat up quickly, looking embarrassed, thinking she would be fired. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again. I promise I'll take care of myself and keep working." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, then placed an envelope on the bedside table. "Use this for your treatment," he said firmly. "Don't argue. Take it." Her eyes widened. "Sir, I don't understand. I don't like repeating myself," he interrupted her, already turning to leave. But before walking out, his voice dropped low, almost soft. "Not everything is about pride, Stephanie. Sometimes you hurt your pride to get what you need." The door closed behind him, and Stephanie sat frozen, staring after him. She was surprised at his words. "Can he really be kind?" she whispered to herself. For the first time since working in the mansion, she didn't just see a cold, impossible billionaire. She saw a man with cracks in his armor, and it left her heart strangely shaken. Stephanie lay back in the large guest bed, her head resting against soft pillows. The faint smell of roses drifted from the vase on the bedside table. She had never been in a room like this before. The silk sheets were smooth against her skin, and the golden lamp filled the space with a warm glow. Everything around her felt like a dream she didn't belong in. But her thoughts were not in the room. They were on the man who had carried her here. The man who, until now, had been nothing but cold, distant, and unreachable. Some hours later, the door opened again. Stephanie quickly sat up, her heart beating fast. She always had a strange fear whenever she saw him. Alexander stepped inside, and for once, he wasn't holding a phone or typing on a laptop. He wore only a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Without the armor of business and power, he looked different, like a regular young man. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Stephanie answered with a soft voice. "I feel better. Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if—" "You don't need to thank me," Alexander interrupted, but his tone was not sharp. It was gentle. He stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the bed. For a moment, he just looked at her, not with coldness, irritation, or annoyance, but with something far more unsettling, with curiosity and maybe even admiration. Stephanie shifted nervously under his gaze. Then, almost without thinking, she asked, "Why are you always so harsh to people?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her eyes widened. I mean, forgive me, sir, I shouldn't have asked that. It's not my place." But to her surprise, he didn't flare up. He didn't scold her or remind her of her position. Instead, his eyes softened for the briefest moment, as if she had touched a place inside him no one else dared to reach. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. And for the first time, Alexander seemed unsure of what to say. He pulled out a chair and sat down close to her bed. For a moment, he looked different. Not sharp, not powerful, but simply surprised. "No one has ever asked me that," he said at last, his voice low. Stephanie hesitated for a while. Then she leaned forward a little, worried she had gone too far. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." But he shook his head slowly. "No, maybe it's time someone heard it." The room grew quiet. The only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the wall. "When I was younger," Alexander began, his words were slow. "I had nothing. No money, no influence, no power. I worked small jobs just to survive. I remember nights when I went to bed hungry because I couldn't afford food. I remember struggling just to pay rent on a tiny broken room." He suddenly gave a sharp laugh, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that hurt. Then, he continued, "All the people I thought cared about me, They disappeared. Friends avoided me. Relatives mocked me. And the girl I thought I loved? His voice cracked for just a second. She left me for another man. She told me I would never be worth anything. Stephanie's heart ached as she listened. She could hardly believe that the same man who owned a mansion, the man everyone feared, had once been humiliated and broken. For the first time, she didn't just see him as rich, she saw him as human. Alexander leaned back in the chair, his eyes drifting somewhere far away, like he was watching memories only he could see. I worked harder than I thought a person could. Day and night I pushed myself. I built everything you see now with my sweat. And when I finally made it, when the money and the power came, guess what happened? They came back? Stephanie whispered, unsure. He looked at her, sharp with surprise. Yes, every single one of them. Suddenly I wasn't worthless anymore. Suddenly, I was important. But I knew the truth. They didn't come back because they cared about me. They came back because of what I had in my bank account. Money made me visible. Not love. Not loyalty. Just money. He stared down at his hands, his voice quiet but heavy with pain. And I swore I would never let anyone use me again. Stephanie's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the weight of his confession pressed hard against her chest. She could almost feel his loneliness, a loneliness so deep that even riches, power, and class could not cure. So, Alexander continued, his voice rougher now, I keep people at a distance. I treat everyone the same way I was treated when I had nothing. Cold, harsh, and ruthless. Because in my mind, everyone is after the same thing. My money. The room went quiet again. Stephanie stared at him. She had never heard him speak like this. Not to anyone. This would be the longest conversation she's ever had with him since she started working at the mansion. Finally, her voice broke the silence. Not everyone is the same. He looked at her as if testing her words, daring her to prove them true. But Stephanie didn't look away. She held his gaze even as her hands trembled in her lap. Yes, there are people who only care about money. But there are also people who care about people. About hearts. About family, love, honesty. I know what it feels like to have nothing. I know what it feels like to struggle. And that's why I would never measure someone's worth based on what they own. For a long moment, he just stared at her. And in that gaze, Stephanie saw something she never thought she would see in him. Vulnerability. You really believe that? He asked quietly, almost disbelieving. Yes, she said without hesitation. He leaned forward with an unexpected smile and told her, then maybe you're different. Then he stood and left the room. For the first time in a very long time, the man who had sworn never to bend, never to be touched, felt something new deep inside him. That night, after leaving Stephanie's room, Alexander could not find sleep. He sat alone in his study. For years, his heart had been quiet, thinking only of money, business, and winning deals. But now, something has changed. He couldn't stop thinking about Stephanie, the maid who looked at him in the face and rejected his money, the woman who spoke to him like he was just a man and not a billionaire, the girl who reminded him that not everyone in the world was the same. Her words echoed in his mind like a gentle song, over and over again, and he found himself loving the feeling. The next morning after Stephanie had fully recovered, something strange happened. As Stephanie walked down the hallway with her bucket and mop, Alexander passed by. Usually, he would walk straight ahead, as if she wasn't even there. But this time, he stopped. Good morning, he said softly. Stephanie almost dropped everything in her hands. Her heart skipped with shock. Good morning, sir, she stammered. It was just two little words, a simple greeting. But to Stephanie, it felt as if the world had shifted. Days went by, and little by little, Alexander began to change. He began stopping by the kitchen, asking if Stephanie had eaten. Sometimes, when her eyes looked heavy with sleep, he even shared a jug of coffee with her. Stephanie didn't know what surprised her more, the fact that he noticed or that he actually cared. Soon, it wasn't just greetings or small kindness. He began to linger while she worked whenever he was at home. At first, their talks were tiny about the busy city or the books he saw in her hands during her break. But slowly, the words grew. They began to laugh at small things. And for the first time, Stephanie saw Alexander smile. Not the polite smile he gave to business partners, but a real genuine one that reached the corner of his eyes. One quiet evening after dinner, Alexander found Stephanie in the sitting room, arranging flowers. He sat down on one of the couches and leaned forward. "Stephanie, tell me about your family," he suddenly said. She froze. "My family?" she asked, surprised. "Yes," he said, watching her intently. "I want to know about them." Stephanie hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before, not the neighbors or her past employers. To them, she was only a worker and nothing more, but Alexander was different. So she took a slow breath and began. "My father left when he discovered Mama was sick," she said quietly. "He promised to return, but he never did. Since then, it has only been Mama, my younger sister, and me. Mama is too ill to work. My sister is still in school. So," her voice trembled, "so I became the one to provide. I took any job I could find. Cleaning, serving tables, sewing for neighbors. That's why I am here right now. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to." Alexander felt pity as he listened. But there was no self-pity in her words, only strength wrapped in quiet pain. "You've carried so much," he told her after listening. Stephanie smiled and replied, "That's what family means. We don't give up on each other." Her words struck him like lightning. He had spent years believing friends and family only exist when you are wealthy. But here she was, proof that loyalty still lived in the world, and for the very first time, he saw the truth. He wasn't just admiring her. He wasn't just grateful to her. He was falling in love with her. That weekend, Alexander held a grand party at his mansion. The halls glittered with men in sharp suits and women in shining gowns. Laughter and music filled the air. In the midst of all the glamour, Stephanie moved quietly through the rooms, carrying trays of wine and serving little plates of food. She kept her head low, reminding herself this was not her world. This was the world of the rich, powerful, and untouchable. And she was just the maid. But what Stephanie did not see was how often Alexander's eyes searched for her. When she walked past, he paused mid-conversation. His eyes were focused on her. By the middle of the night, some of his old business friends began to notice the way he looked at Stephanie, as if she was the only person in the mansion. One of them laughed loudly. "Alex," he teased, "don't tell me it's true. You're staring at the maid, as if she's a queen." The others joined in and laughed in a mocking way. "A maid, Alexander? Out of all the women chasing you, she is the only one that caught your attention? Ha! The great Alexander Williams, falling for a girl who scrubs floors?" Their cruel laughter rang out, echoing over the music. Stephanie froze. Her heart pounded as the words reached her ears. Every laugh felt like a knife. She wanted to vanish. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her. But Alexander did not laugh. He did not brush it aside. Instead, his next words silenced the room. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice steady as stone. "I have fallen for her." The laughter stopped, and everyone's eyes turned to him in shock. But Alexander didn't waver. He walked across the room, straight to Stephanie, and gently took the tray from her trembling hands. "She is not just a maid," he declared, looking her straight in the eyes. "She is strong. She is brave. She is honest in ways none of you will ever understand. She works harder than anyone I know, and her heart is bigger than all your riches combined. If that makes me a fool, then I am proud to be one." Stephanie's heart raced so fast she could barely breathe. Was this real? Was this truly happening? Then Alexander's voice softened. "Stephanie, I tried to fight it, but I can't anymore. I love you." Tears filled her eyes. For so long, she had buried her feelings, telling herself they could never be real. She didn't belong in his world, or so she believed. But now, hearing his words, she could not hold back. She embraced him passionately. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but neither of them cared. Alexander cupped her face with gentle hands and kissed her. Not as a billionaire showing off, but as a man who had finally found the missing piece of his soul. The crowd clapped and cheered. But hidden among the applause, one of his friends watched with cold eyes, concealing a displeasure that would not stay hidden for long. After the incident at the party, Alexander and Stephanie became closer. They talked more often and spent more time together whenever she was done with work and when he is free. Just when Stephanie thought her life was finally filled with love, trouble came quietly. One evening, Alexander sat in his study when an envelope was handed to him by his personal assistant. Inside were pictures of Stephanie. She was working in an adults club, carrying trays of drinks, but the photos made it look much worse than it was. Alexander's heart, already full of scars from past betrayals, froze with pain. To him, it felt like the girl he trusted was just like everyone else who had once hurt him. In that moment, all his walls of doubt rose up again. A few minutes later, the door opened quietly and Stephanie walked into the study later, smiling faintly as she carried a basket of fresh flowers for the vase in the study. But before she could place them down, Alexander's voice startled her. "Stephanie," Alexander said in a cold voice, standing beside his desk with the photographs spread out before him like evidence in a trial. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully, knowing this was not the best time to call him by name. With pain and anger in his eyes, he pointed to the pictures on his desk. "Explain this," he demanded. She stepped closer, and her face was filled with shock when she saw the images. With trembling lips, she tried to speak. "Alex, this isn't what it looks like." "Then what is it?" he asked, his voice flat but his fists clenched tightly at his side. "I trusted you and this is who you really are?" Stephanie's chest ached as if her heart itself was breaking, and she stepped forward with tears burning her eyes. "Please listen to me," she pleaded. "Yes, I worked in that place, but only as a waitress. I never danced. I never sold myself. I never gave away my dignity. I was desperate, Alex. My mother was very sick. She needed medicine, and I had no other choice. But the moment I found another job, I left that job behind forever. That is the truth. I swear it." Her words rushed out, filled with pain and sincerity, and in her eyes was a desperate cry, begging him to believe her. But Alexander only shook his head, and his face grew hard like stone. "You don't understand, Stephanie. I've been fooled before too many times. Everyone has a story, everyone has excuses, and you're no different." The words cut deeper than he even realized, stabbing her heart like a blade. Tears filled Stephanie's eyes, but her voice rose, shaking with both pain and anger. "Is that what you truly think of me? After everything I've done, after everything I've shared, do you really believe I am like the rest?" For a long, painful silence, Stephanie stood there staring at him. She didn't see the man who cared anymore. Instead, she saw the old Alexander again, the cold, ruthless man she knew at first. That day, she tried to go about her chores as usual. She set the flowers down and wiped the tables. But everywhere she turned, she could feel his cold eyes on her, reminding her she would never be trusted. By midnight, Stephanie sat on the edge of her bed in the servants' quarters. She had cried until her pillow was soaked, until her body had no more tears to give. Now her face was dry, but her heart had grown heavy. She had fallen deeply for him, and that love made everything harder. But she could not stay, because seeing him would only hurt her the most. So she wrote her resignation. "I cannot work for someone who refuses to believe in me. I came here to earn an honest living, not to be shamed for the mistakes of my past. Goodbye, Alexander." The next morning, she left the letter neatly folded on his desk. Her room was empty, her belongings gone. When Alexander finally opened it and read her words, something inside him cracked. For the first time in years, the billionaire who had sworn he would never let anyone close felt his chest tighten in fear and regret. But he told himself she was just like the rest. For days, Alexander couldn't concentrate. The mansion felt unbearably quiet without Stephanie humming as she worked, or her gentle knock at his door before bringing him tea. He told himself over and over that he did not care, that she was just another servant who had left. But each time he walked past the servants' quarters, his chest ached with a pain he could not ignore. One quiet afternoon, his personal assistant, Mr. Howard, entered the office. "Sir," Howard began carefully. "About Miss Stephanie." Alexander's head snapped up. "What about her?" he asked. Howard cleared his throat and placed a small folder gently on the desk. "I think you should know the truth. Those photographs that were sent to you, they were not the full story. I made some inquiries. With stiff hands, Alexander pulled the folder open, and as he read, his heart began to sink. Inside was a report. Stephanie had worked at that club only once, just one night. She had begged the manager to pay her in advance because her mother needed urgent treatment at the hospital. She had never gone back after that, and several witnesses confirmed it. Alexander's throat grew tight, and his hands shook as he closed the folder. One night. Only one night. And I didn't believe her, he told himself in regret. For the first time in years, regret hit him like a storm. His mind replayed her tearful eyes, her trembling voice, and her desperate question. You really believe I'm like them? He had broken the heart of the only woman who had ever cared for him without asking for anything in return. That evening, Alexander sat alone in his mansion, staring at her resignation note. It felt like a wound that wouldn't close. He realized that all his wealth, all his power, and all the walls he had built around his heart had given him nothing but emptiness. For the first time, he admitted the truth to himself. He needed her. So, he made a decision to bury his ego and go in search of her. He tried calling her number, but the line was switched off. He sent his driver to her old apartment, only to learn she had already moved out. Restless and desperate, Alexander went himself, visiting the modest neighborhood where she once lived. At last, he found her neighbor, an elderly woman who sold fruits and groceries by the roadside. "Oh, Stephanie," the woman said kindly. "She's been going to the hospital every day. Her mother isn't well. Her health became worse, and they had to admit her." Alexander felt more hurt. He thanked the woman quickly, and without wasting another breath, he drove straight to the hospital she mentioned. When Alexander arrived at the hospital, he saw Stephanie sitting on a bench outside the ward. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. Yet even in that fragile state, she was still the most beautiful soul he had ever known. He stood there in silence for a long moment, just watching her. Then, gathering his courage, he walked forward. "Stephanie," he called. Her head lifted sharply at the sound of his voice. For a second, her eyes softened, then hardened again. She rose to her feet. "Why are you here?" Alexander swallowed hard. "Because I owe you an apology. 1,000 apologies. I didn't believe you when I should have. I let my past blind me, and I hurt you more than I ever meant to." She crossed her arms, her voice trembling with anger. "Hurt me? You destroyed my trust, Alexander. I told you the truth, and you threw it in my face." "I know," he admitted, his voice breaking with regret. "And I hate myself for it. I found out the truth. You worked there only one night, and it was for your mother. Stephanie, I was wrong. I was terribly, unforgivably wrong." Tears filled her eyes, but she turned away, not wanting him to see. "Do you know what it feels like to open your heart to someone, only for them to think the worst of you?" Alexander stepped closer. "Yes. That is why I built walls around myself, why I pushed everyone away. But you broke through those walls, Stephanie, and I panicked. I let fear destroy what was real. But I don't want to lose you." Stephanie's heart caught between love and anger. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Words are easy, Alexander. But trust is harder." Alexander reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "Then let me show you. I have already taken care of your mother's medical bills. Every single one of them. Not because I pity you, not because I want you to owe me anything, but because you and your family deserve better. Because you deserve better. And I will keep proving it. If it takes days or months or years, I will not stop. I will keep fighting for your trust until the day you finally believe me. Because I love you, Stephanie. I love you with everything in me." Stephanie's lips trembled. She wanted to stay angry, to push him away. But her heart betrayed her. Slowly, with tears slipping down her cheeks, she whispered through a broken smile, "You're such a stubborn man, Alexander." And before he could find the words to reply, she stepped forward and hugged him. Alexander held her tightly, as though he would never let go again. "I'm very sorry, Stephanie," he said for the first time in many years. After that night at the hospital, things changed between Alexander and Stephanie. He began visiting her mother's ward often, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man who cared. Sometimes he brought flowers. Other times he just sat quietly with Stephanie, holding her hand. At first she was cautious. testing whether his change was real or just temporary. But day by day, his actions proved louder than his words. One evening, as they walked outside the hospital together, Stephanie looked at him and asked softly, "Why are you doing all this?" Alexander turned to her. "Because I cannot stand watching you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders alone. Let me carry some of it for you." For the first time since everything had fallen apart, she smiled at him again. They started spending more time together, not in glamorous places, but in simple moments. He took her to a small bakery he loved as a boy, telling her about the days he couldn't even afford bread while she showed him her sketchbook, filled with drawings she'd made in the quiet hours after work. "I wanted to study art in college," she admitted, "but life had other plans for me." Alexander's friends still made fun of him for loving Stephanie. One even lied, saying she only cared about his money. But this time, Alexander stood strong. He looked at his friend and said, "I'd rather lose all my money than lose her." That night, Alexander told Stephanie the truth about the lies, the photos, and how he had left those friends behind. Stephanie held his hand and smiled softly. "You've changed, Alexander," she whispered. He touched her cheek and replied, "No, you changed me." Months later, Alexander organized a small dinner at the mansion. Not a grand, glittering party, but an intimate setting with family and a few real friends. When drinks were served, he stood up, his heart pounding, and walked over to Stephanie. She looked up at him, confused, until he sank to one knee. Gasps filled the room. "Stephanie," he said, voice trembling but firm, "you came into my life when I least expected it. You taught me trust, kindness, and love. I don't care about what the world thinks. I only care about you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Then, with a radiant smile, she whispered, "Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and when they kissed, it wasn't the kiss of a billionaire and his maid. It was simply the kiss of two souls who had finally found home in each other. And from that day on, they wrote a new story. A story of love stronger than pride, wealth, or fear. Moral of the story: hard work and honesty always shine through. Even when life is unfair, staying kind and doing your best can open doors to bigger opportunities. Money cannot buy true love or respect. What matters most is the goodness of the heart, not riches or fancy things. Never judge people too quickly. Everyone has a story, and sometimes the people we think the least of can surprise us with courage, strength, and love. What lesson did you learn from this story? I'd love to know your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And stay tuned. A brand new emotional story will be coming in just a few days. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss it. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for watching.